Borrhomeo the Astrologer by Sheridan Fanu. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Borrhomeo the Astrologer, A Monkish Tale by Sheridan Fanu. At the period of the famous plague of Milan in 1630, a frenzy of superstition seized upon the population high and low. Old prophecies of a diabolical visitation reserved for their city in that particular year of grace prepared the way for this wild panic of the imagination. When the plague broke out, terror seems to have acted to a degree scarcely paralleled upon the fancy or the credulity of the people. Excitement in very many cases produced absolutely the hallucinations of madness. Persons deposed in the most solemn and consistent terms to have themselves witnessed diabolical processions, spoken with an awful impersonation of Satan, and been solicited amidst scenes and personages altogether supernatural to lend their human agency to the nefarious designs of the fiend by consenting to disseminate by certain prescribed means the virus of the pestilence. Some of the stories related of persons possessed by these awful fancies are in print, and by no means destitute of a certain original and romantic horror. That which I am about to tell, however, has, I believe, never been printed. At all events, I saw it only in manuscripts, sewed up in vellum, with a psaltery and a half-dozen lives of saints, in the library of the old Dominican monastery which stands about 2 leagues to the northeast of the city. With your permission, I am about to give you the best translation I was able to make of this short but odd story, of the truth of which, judging from the company in which I found it, the honest monks entertained no sort of doubt. You are to remember that all sorts of tales of wonder were at that time flying about and believed in Milan, and that many of these were authenticated in such a way as to leave no doubt as to the bona fides of those who believed themselves to have been eyewitnesses of what they told. Monks and country padres, of course, believed, but so did men who stood highest in the church, and who, unless fame belied them, believed little else. In the year of our Lord, 1630, when Satan, by divine permission appearing among us in person, afflicted our beautiful city of Milan with a pestilence unheard of in its severity, there lived in the Strada Piana, which has lately been pulled down, an astrologer calling himself Borromeo. Some say he came from Perugia, others from Venice, I know not. He it was who first predicted in the year of our Lord 1628, by means of his art, that the pale comet which then appeared would speedily be followed not by war or by famine, but by pestilence, which accordingly came to pass. Beside his skill in astrology, which was wonderful, he was profoundly versed in alchemy. He was a man great in stature and strong, though old in years, and with a most reverent beard. But though seemingly austere in his life, it is said that he was given up in secret to enormous wickedness, having shut himself up in his house for more than a month, with his furnace and crucibles. Truly he had made repeated and near approaches to the grand arcanum. He had arrived, as he supposed, at the moment of projection. He collects the powder and tries it on molten lead. It was a failure. He was too wise to be angry. The long pursuit of his art had taught him patience. But while he is pondering in a profound and gloomy reverie, a retort, which he has forgotten in the furnace, explodes. He sees in the smoke a pale young man, dressed in mourning, with black hair, and viewing him with a sad and reproachful countenance. Borromeo, who lived among chimeras, is not utterly overcome, as another man might be, and confronts him, amazed, indeed, but not terrified. The stranger shook his head like a holy young confessor, who hears an evil shrift, and says he, rather sternly, "Borromeo, Borromeo, beware of covetousness, which is idolatry. On this sordid pursuit which you call a science, have you wasted your days on earth and your peace hereafter?" "Young man," says the alchemist, too much struck by the manner and reproof of the stranger to ask himself how he came there, "wealth is power, to do good as well as evil. To seek it is, therefore, an ambition as honorable as any other." "We both know why you seek it, and how you would employ it," answers the young man gravely. The old man's face flushed with anger at this rebuke. and he looked down frowningly to the table whereon lay the book of his spells. But he bethought him this must be a good spirit, and he was abashed. Nevertheless, he roused his courage and shook his white mane back, and was on the point of answering sternly, when the young man said with a melancholy smile, "Besides, you will never discover the grand arcanum, the elixir vitae, or the philosopher's stone." His words, which were as soft as snowflakes, fell like an iron mace upon the heart of the seer. "Perhaps not," said the astrologer frigidly. "Not perhaps," said the stranger. "At all events, young man, for as such you appear, and I know what spirits seek who take that shape. The science has its charms for me, and when the pleasures of the young are as harmless as the amusements of the aged, I'll hear you question mine." "You know not what spirit you are of. As for me, I am contrite and humble. Well I may," says the stranger faintly with a sigh. "Besides, what you have pursued in vain and will never by your own researches find, I have discovered." "What? Yes, the tincture that can prolong life to virtual immortality, and the dust that can change that lead into gold. But I care for neither." "Why, young man, if this be true," said Borromeo in a rapture of wonder, "you stand before me an angel of wisdom, in power and immortality like a god." "No," says the stranger, "a long-lived fellow with a long purse, that's all." "All? Everything?" cries the old man. Will you? "Yes, sir, you shall see," says the young man in black. "Give me that crucible. It is all a matter of proportions. Water, clay, and air are the material of all the vegetable world. The flowers and forests, the wines and the fruits. The seed is both the laboratory and the chemist, and knows how, with the sun's help, to apportion and combine." While he said this with the abstracted manner of one whose mind is mazed in a double reverie, while his hands work out some familiar problem, he tumbled over the alchemist's papers, and unstopped and stopped his bottles of crystals, precipitates, and elixirs, taking a little from this and a little from that, and throwing all into a small gold cup that stood on the table. But, like a juggler, he moved those bottles so deftly that the quick eyes and retentive soul of the old man vainly sought to catch or keep the order of the process. When he had done, there was hardly a thimbleful. "Is that it?" whispered the old man, twinkling with greedy eyes. "No," said the stranger, with a sly smile. "There is one very simple ingredient which you have forgotten." He took a large, flat, oval gold box, with some hair set under a crystal in the lid of it, and, looking at it for a moment, he seemed to sigh. He tapped it like a snuff-box. There was within it a powder like vermilion, and on the inside of the lid, in the center, was the small enamel portrait of a beautiful but sinister female face. The features were so very beautiful, and the expression so strangely blended with horror, that it fixed the gaze of the old man for a moment, and, was it illusion? He thought he saw the face steadily dilating, as if it would gradually fill the lid of the box, and even expand to human dimensions. "Yes," said the stranger, as having taken some of the red powder, he shut the cover down again with a snap. "She was beautiful, and her lineaments are still clear and bright. Nothing like darkness to keep them from fading. And so the poor little miniature is again in prison." Then he dropped the box back into his pocket. Then he took 2 iron ladles, and heating in the one his powder to a white heat, and bidding the alchemist melt a pellet of lead in the other, and pour it into the ladle which held the powder, there arose a beautiful purple fire in the bottom of it, with an intense fringe of green and yellow, and when it subsided there was a little nut of gold there of the bigness of the leaden pellet. The fiery eyes of the alchemist almost leaped from their sockets into the iron cup, and he could have clasped his marvelous visitor round the knees and worshipped him. "And now," says the stranger very gently and earnestly, "in return for satisfying your curiosity, I ask only your solemn promise to prosecute this dread science no more." "You'll not give it. Take then my warning, and remember the wages of this knowledge is sorrow." "But won't you tell me how to commute, and you have not produced the elixir?" the old man cried. "'Tis folly, and, as I've told you, worse, a snare," answered the young man, sighing heavily. "I came not to satisfy, but to rebuke your dangerous, though fruitless frenzy. Besides, I hear my friend still pacing the street. Hark, he taps at the window." Then came a sharp rattle, as of a cane tapping angrily on the window. The young man bowed, smiling sadly, and somehow got himself away, though without hurry, yet so quickly that the old man could not reach the door till after it had closed and he was gone. "Oaf that I am!" cried the astrologer, losing patience and stamping on the ground. "How have I let him go? He hesitated. He would have yielded. His scruples, benevolent perhaps, I could have quieted. And yet in the very crisis I was tongue-tied and motionless, and let him go." He pushed open the little window from which he observed the street, and thought he saw the stranger walking round the corner, conversing with a little hunchback in a red cloak, and followed by an ugly dog. At sight of the great white head and beard and the fierce features of the alchemist, bleared and tanned in the smoke of his furnace, people stopped and looked. So he withdrew, and in haste got himself ready for the street, waiting for no refreshment, though he had fasted long, for he had the strength as well as the stature of a giant, and forth he went. By this time the twilight had passed into night. He had his mantle about him, and his rapier and dagger, for the streets were dangerous, and a feather in his cap, and his white beard hidden behind the fold of his cloak. So he might have passed for a tall soldier of the guard. The pestilence kept people much within doors, and the streets more solitary than was customary. He had walked through the town 2 hours and more before he met with anything to speak of. Then, lo, on a sudden, near the fountain of the Lion, it being then moonlight, he discovers in a solitude the figure of his visitor, standing with the hunchback and the dog, which he knew by its ungainly bones, and its carrying its huge head so near the ground. So he shouts along the silent street, "Stay a moment, signor!" and he mends his pace. But they were parting company there, it seemed, and away went the deformed with his unsightly beast at his heels, and this way came the youth in black. So, standing full in his way, and doffing his cap, and throwing back his cloak that his snowy beard and head might appear, and the stranger recognized him when he drew nigh, he cried, "Borromeo implores thee to take pity on his ignorance." "What? Still mad?" said the young man. "This man will waste the small remnant of his years in godless search after gold and immortality. Better he should know all and feel their vanity." "Better 1,000 times!" cried the old man in ecstasy. "There is in this city, signor, at this time, in great secrecy, the master who taught me," says the youth, "the master of all alchemists. Many centuries since he found out the elixir vitae. From him I've learned the few secrets that I know, and without his leave I dare not impart them. If you desire it, I will bring you before him, but, once in his presence, you cannot recede, and his conditions you must accept." All with my whole heart, but some reasonable pleasures." "With your pleasures he will not interfere. He cannot change your heart," said the young man, with one of his heavy sighs. "But you know what gold is and what the elixir is, and power and immortality are not to be had for nothing." "Lead on, signor, I'm ready," cries the old man, whose face flushed, and his eyes burned with the fires of an evil rapture. "Take my hand," said the young man, more stern and pale than he had yet appeared. So he did, and his conductor seized it with a cold gripe, and they walked swiftly on. Now he led him through several streets, and on their way Borromeo passes his notary, and lingering a moment asks him whether he has a bond, signed by a certain merchant, with whom he had contracted for a loan. The notary, who was talking to another, says suddenly to that other, "Perbacco, I've just called to mind a matter that must be looked after for Signor Borromeo," and he called him a nickname which incensed the astrologer, who struck him a lusty box upon the ear. "There's a humming in my ear tonight," said the notary, going into his house. "I hope it is no sign of the plague." So on they walked side by side till they reached the shop of a vintner of no good repute. It was well known to Borromeo, a house of evil resort, where the philosopher sometimes stole, disguised by night to be no longer a necromancer but a man, and so from a man to become a beast. They passed through the shop. The host, with a fat, pale face and a villainous smile, was drawing wine, which a handsome damsel was waiting to take away with her. He kissed her as she paid, and she gave him a cuff on his fat white chops and laughed. "What's become of Signor Borromeo?" said the girl, "that he never comes here now?" "Why, here he is!" cries Borromeo with a saturnine smile, and he slaps his broad palm on her shoulder. But the girl only shrugged with a little shiver and said, "What a chill down my back! They're walking over my grave now." The Italian phrase here is very nearly equivalent. "Why, they neither hear nor see me," said the astrologer, amazed. They went into the inner room, where guests used to sit and drink, but the plague had stopped all that, and the room was empty. "He's in there," said the young man. "You'll see him presently." Borromeo was filled with an awful curiosity. He knew the room, he thought, well, and there never had been, he thought, a door where the young man had pointed. But there was now a drapery there, like what covers a doorway, and it swelled and swayed slowly in the wind. "Some centuries," said the astrologer, looking on the dark drapery. "Geber, perhaps, or Alfarabi. It matters not a pin's point what his name. You'll call him my lord, simply, and, observe, we alchemists are a potent order, and it behoves you to keep your word with us." "I will be true," said Borromeo. "And use the powers you gain beneficently," repeated his guide. "I'm but a sinner. I will strive, with only an exception, in favor of such things as make wealth and life worth having," answered the philosopher. "See, take this, and do as I bid you," said the youth, giving him a thin round film of human skin. How the honest monk who wrote the tale, or even Borromeo himself, knew this and many other matters he describes, 'tis for him to say. "Breathe on it," said he. And when he did so, he made him stretch it to the size of a sheet of paper, which he did quite easily. "Now, cover your face with it as with a napkin." So he did. "'Twill do. Give it to me. It is but a picture, see?" And it slowly shrunk until its disk was just the same as that of the lady's miniature in the lid of the box over which he fixed it. Borromeo beheld his own picture. "Every adept has his portrait here," said the young man. "So good a likeness is always pleasant, but these have a power beside, and establish a sympathy between their originals and their possessor, which secures discipline and silence." "How does it work?" asked Borromeo. "Have I not been your good angel?" said the young man, sitting before him. He extends his legs, pushing out his feet, and letting his chin sink on his chest. He fixes his eyes upon him with a horrible and sarcastic glare, and one of his feet contracts and divides into a goatish stump. Borromeo would have burst into a yell, but he could not. "It is a nightmare, is it not?" said the stranger, who seemed delighted to hold him minute after minute in that spell. At last the shoe and hose that seemed to have shrunk apart like burning parchment closed over the goatish shin and hoof, and rising he shook him by the shoulder. With a gasp the astrologer started to his feet. "There, I told you it was a nightmare, or what you please. I could not have done it but through the picture. You see how fast we have you. You must for once resemble a Christian, Borromeo, and with us deal truly and honestly." "You've promised me the elixir vitae," the old man said, fearful lest the secret should escape him. "And you shall have it. Go bring a cup of wine. He'll not see you, nor the wine, nor the cup." So he brought a cup of Falernian, which he loved the best. "There's 50 years of life for every drop," said the youth. "Let me live 1,000 years, to begin with," cries Borromeo. "Beware, you'll tire of it." "Nay, give me the 20 drops." So he took the cup and measured the drops, and as they fell the wine was agitated with a gentle simmer all over, and threw out ring after ring of purple, green, and gold. And Borromeo drank it, and sucked in the last drop in ecstasy, and cried out, blaspheming with joy and sensual delight, "And I'm to have this secret too!" "This and all others when you claim them," said the young man. "See, 'tis time," he added. and Borromeo saw that the great misshapen dog he had seen in the street was sniffing by the stranger's feet. When they went into the inner room, there was a large table, and many men at either side, and at the head a gigantic man, with a face like the face of a beast, but the flesh was as of a man. Borromeo quaked in his presence. "I am aware of what hath passed, Borromeo," he said. "The condition is this. You take this vial, and with the fluid it contains and the sponge, trace the letter S on every door of every church and religious house within the walls of Milan. The dog will go with you." It was a fiend in dog shape, says the monkish writer, and had he failed in his task would have torn him in pieces. So Borromeo, that old arch-villain, undertook this office cheerfully, well knowing what its purpose was. For it was a thing notorious that Satan was himself in a bodily though phantasmal shape seen before in Milan, and that he had tempted others to a like fascinorious action. But happily for their souls in vain. The Stygian satellites of the fiend had power to smear the door of every unconsecrated house in Milan with that pestilential virus, as indeed the citizens with their own eyes, when first the plague broke out, beheld upon their own doors. But they could not defile the church gates, nor the doors of the monasteries, and according to the conditions under which their infernal malice is bound, they could in no wise effect it save by the hand of one who was baptized, which to the baleful abuse of that holy sacrament the wretch, Borromeo, had been. He did his accursed and murderous office well and fearlessly. His reward Mammon, an indefinite long life. The hell-dog by his side compelling him, and the belief in his invisibility making him confident withal. But therein was shown forth to all the world the craft of the fiend, and the just judgment of heaven. For he was plainly seen in the very act by the sexton of the church of St. Mary of the Passion, and by the pastor of the convent of St. Justina of Padna, and the same officer of the Olivetans of St. Victor. So, finding in the morning the only too plain and fatal traces of what he had been doing, with a mob at their heels, who would have had his life but for the guard, they arrested him in his house next morning, and the mob breaking in, smashed all the instruments of his infernal art, and would have burnt the house had they been allowed. He, being duly arraigned, was, according to law, put to the torture, and forthwith confessed all the particulars I have related. So he was cast into a dungeon to await execution, which secretly he dreaded not, being confident in the efficacy of the elixir he had swallowed. He was not to be put to death by decapitation. It was justly thought too honorable for so sordid a miscreant. He was sentenced to be hanged, and after hanging a day and a night, he was to be laid in an open grave outside the gate on the Roman road, and there impaled, and after 3 days' exposure to be covered in, and so committed to the keeping of the earth, no more to groan under his living enormities. The night before his execution, thinking deeply on the virtue of the elixir, and having assured himself by many notable instances, which he easily brought to remembrance, that they could not deprive him, even by this severity of his life, he lifted up his eyes and beheld the young man, in mourning suit, whose visit had been his ruin, standing near him in the cell. This slave of Satan affected a sad countenance at first, and said he, "We are cast down, Borromeo, by reason of thy sentence." "But we've cheated them," answers he, pretending maybe more confidence than he had. "They can't kill me?" "That's certain," rejoins the fiend. "I shall live for 1,000 years," says he. "Aye, you must continue to live for full 1,000 years. 'Tis a fair term, is it not?" "A great deal may be done in that time," says the old man, while beads of perspiration covered his puckered forehead, and he thought that perhaps he might cheat him, too, and make his peace with heaven. "They can't hang me," says Borromeo. "Oh, yes, they will certainly hang you, but then you'll live through it." "Aye, the elixir!" cried the prisoner. Thus stands the case. When an ordinary man is hanged, he dies outright. But you can't die.
"No, I can't die."
Therefore, when you are hanged, you feel, think, hear, and so forth during the process.
"Saint Anthony, But then 'tis only an hour, 1 hour of agony, and it ends.
You are to hang for a whole day and night, continued the fiend. But that don't signify. Then when they take you down, you continue to feel, hear, think, and if they leave your eyes open, to see, just as usual.
Why, yes, certainly, I'm alive,
cries Borromeo. Yes, alive, quite alive, although you appear to be dead, says the demon with a smile.
Aye, but what's the best moment to make my escape?
Says Borromeo.
Escape?
Why, you have escaped. They can't kill you. No one can kill you until your time is out. Then you know they lay you in an open grave and impale you.
What?
roared the old sinner.
You are jesting.
Hush. Depend upon it, they will go through with it. The old man shook in every joint. Then, after 3 days and nights, they bury you, said his visitor.
I'll lose my life, or I'll break from them,
shouts the gigantic astrologer. But you can't lose your life, and you can't break from them, says the fiend softly.
Why not? Oh, blessed saints, I'm stronger than you think.
Aye, muscle, bones. You are an old giant.
Surely, cries the old man, and the terror of a dead man rising. Don't you see? They fly before me, and so I escape.
But you can't rise.
Say in heaven's name what you mean,
thundered old Borromeo. Do you remember, senor, that nightmare, as we jocularly called it, at the sign of the red hat? Well, a man who, having swallowed the elixir vitae, suffers that sort of shock which in other mortals is a violent death, is afflicted during the remainder of his period of life, whether he be decapitated or dismembered, or is laid unmutilated in the grave with that sort of catalepsy which you experienced for a minute, a catalepsy that does not relax or intermit. For that reason you ought to have carefully avoided this predicament.
'Tis a lie,
roared the old man, and he ground his teeth.
That's not living.
You'll find upon my honor that it is living, answered the fiend, with a gentle smile, and withdrawing from the cell. Borromeo told all of this to a priest, not under seal of confession, but to induce him to plead for his life. But the good man, seeing he had already made himself the liegeman and accomplice of Satan, refused, nor would his intercession have prevailed in any wise. So Borromeo was hanged, impaled, and buried, according to his sentence. And it came to pass that 14 years afterwards that grave was opened, and making a great drain from the group of houses thereby. And Borromeo was found just as he was laid therein, in no wise decayed, but fresh and sound, which indeed showed that there did remain in him that sort of life which was supposed to ward off the common consequences of death. So he was thrown into a great pit, and with many curses covered in with stones and earth, where his stupendous punishment proceeds. Get thee hence, Satan. End of Borromeo the Astrologer by J. Sheridan Fanu.